Welcome back to Beagle Eye Visions Internet. We're going to continue episode 20 and wrap it up. That way we can get to episode 21. Shout out to Doug Martin. I'll leave a link. I'll leave a link to some more of his work for those who are interested, for those who have true care. I'll leave a link to more of his work in the description of this video. And, I've already talked enough, so let's go. We're going to do the Great Wall of China and then visit the city of Chang'an, and then we'll see where we go from there. Let's get some more knowledge.
So the whole idea of venerating in cosmology with mythology is about an expression that's attempted to be preserved somewhere where it can always be reconciled and cannot be destroyed.
Right.
So like in The Lion King, when he's telling him to look into the stars to reconnect with his ancestry, which in that case was his own father who had been slain. It's really about that the knowledge was stored in a very special way in the cosmology, and that it's up to us to gather enough knowledge unto ourselves by any means available, essentially, in whatever predicament we find ourselves in, and still be able to reconcile it, because the stars are still there, they can't be destroyed.
Right.
So as we said earlier on one of the earlier shows, all new religions endeavor to obliterate all traces of their predecessors. I'm saying that, our earliest ancestry understood that there was potential for the earliest human mental processes to become endangered as knowledge developed, which is the case, particularly in the solar phase. The solar phase have spent most of their energy endeavoring to obliterate all traces of their predecessors. So while in the beginning of the solar phase, they're trying to bring on the tenets of the stellar and the lunar, but as the solar phase moved forward and became more and more corrupted,
Westing, right?
it's westing in the sense that you've come into the north. It's
right.
Westing in the sense that you made it primacy in the north. But westing is associated with the solar doctrine. So if we're talking south to north, we got to clarify. We go back to, if we turn the first degree tracing board onto its right side, as we move towards the west, we're moving towards the floor of base consciousness. And that the solar pillar goes on top, which is where we find the northern direction, and that corresponds to primacy in the north. So that first degree tracing board really typifies what you're saying, but we have to be able to read it properly. That there's danger in going into this masculine imbalance. Why is the northern hemisphere associated with the masculine? Partly because it's rugged, partly because it represents erect, upright, the upper. There's a lot of reasons that the masculine energy in the solar force is associated with the northern hemisphere. It represents, like if you take a circle, this is in relation to solar doctrine, but it's still relative to stellar. Let's just say you take a two-dimensional view of the planet, and the northern pole is at the top and the southern pole is at the bottom, and then you divide that in half with the equator. Well, everything above the equator represents a half circle in an upright form, which corresponds to blade, which is equilateral triangle in an upright position. That's masculine. It's the mound. It's the mountain. It's the mount. It's masculine because it's, even though it's not pointy, it still represents, it typifies a hill. And that typifies a penetrative quality, like an upright triangle typifies a penetrative quality. So the triangle inverted, the lower southern portion of the hemisphere below the equator, represents the chalice. That's symbolic, typifying feminine principle, the chalice, which is typified by inverted equilateral triangle. So what I'm trying to say is these are the kinds of ideas that the stellar people who are the pyramid builders are concerned about. So we have to understand that they have this knowledge base, and that this knowledge base took hundreds of thousands of years to develop and understand. I like to say it this way. The stellar people could not afford the luxury of dogma. So their very survival depended on truth. So truth is that which they cared about above and all else, because they cannot afford the luxury of dogma. Their very survival depends on understanding truth, and everything that they did in that earlier civilization is about finding truth and finding ways to preserve truth. So we're talking about a body of knowledge that took a tremendous period of time to develop, and methods to teach it along with the knowledge developed over long periods of time. So the idea is if that knowledge gets lost, there's not really any way to recover it, or potentially there's potential for it to be lost forever. So a lot of what they're endeavoring to do is find ways to prevent that from happening, including the building of the pyramids.
Speaking of the builders of the pyramids and understanding the origins of the pyramids, or the stellar cult, you gave us a tiny peek into the idea of the origins and secret societies, which I find to be very fascinating on how anyone could come to understand something like that, especially if one comes from the historical evidence angle, which is, that's what a lot of people are going to come to it from. I think many may want to know a specific year or when this started, and this is a pre-question that I asked, that I thought I was going to ask earlier, and I ended up already kind of asking you where or what time these things took place. And I know that it's very hard to really like pinpoint that, but I think many want to know a specific year when this started, and how did you come to know that when I'm talking about secret societies?
If we're using in terms of a particular year, well, that year that we're talking about doesn't exist in any context of what we know as modern calendar.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to estimate based on how many years back, and we're going to do that based on great year cycles. So how many great year cycles, which constitute roughly 26,000 year cycle, have evolved, or how many great year cycles have commenced and recommenced, let's say, since the pyramids were built? Or let's say how many great year cycles have commenced and recommenced since it became Horus of the Double Horizon, before it went primacy in the north. So I'm just going to try to give you an example here to show you how difficult that is, but what that work looks like and sounds like, okay? And when we study indigenous America, we're going to find that it's difficult because a lot of the information that we want is not available to us. And in working with what we got, in many cases, it seems like, ironically or strangely enough, we don't have as much even local, because we're here in America, traces of these indigenous peoples. So that this European phase of this solar cult has done one hell of a tremendous job obliterating most of what was here in the northern Americas regarding the indigenous cultures. So just as an example, this is going to give you an idea what the research is going to entail and help us better understand. Okay, so, because I want to say, in a way, I'm giving you a hypothetical number, but it's not a hypothetical number when we understand how to flesh it out. And that the evidence that we need to flesh out this timeline is largely only in the Nile Valley, but we can use what we find spread out all over the globe and finding the ubiquity to corroborate and confirm what appears to be happening as we dig down into the strata and the layers only in the Nile Valley. So for instance, I'm making the claim that all of the indigenous American peoples that were here before the European colonialists had exodus at some point, at some phase, post-totemic or pre-totemic, from Egypt. If it's post-totemic, then they have customs. And these customs are largely in a stagnated form, but still they're endeavoring to preserve what they have. And So much time has passed. In many cases, they don't understand the full significance of it. But the very fact that they endeavored for so long to preserve what they had, it does survive into the modern world. And with the amount of knowledge that we have now, particularly concerning Babylon and Egypt, we can start to make sense out of what we're finding. So, for instance, obviously North America is fully in the north, and that represents primacy in the north. But strangely, many of the indigenous American cultures still have Sut as their primary deity. That's why we have tribes like the Crow. So I'm going to make this assertion here. In my estimate, the earliest indigenous American totemic peoples had arrived here, in my estimations, about 250,000 years ago. So if that's true, and then we're finding the cultures that still have Sut as primary deity, and the pyramids are built 150,000 years ago, and that's primacy in the north, which we know means Horus as god of North Pole primary deity, then we know that Horus Behutet, Horus of the double horizons, is happening somewhere between 250 to 150,000 years ago. So we can make a safe estimation that roughly Horus Behutet happened about 200,000 years ago. And that because I'm saying that the stellar cult is at least 300,000 years old. But, in my research, I think it's probably closer to 500,000 or 600,000 years old, which means it had evolved into the hero cult phase beyond totemic sociology. But that we have to remember that these early myth makers were also the early astronomers, and that they're using the stars to store knowledge. That's what I'm trying to say. So the early myth makers constitute the earliest hero cult, and the earliest hero cult constitutes evolving beyond totemic sociology, and that the earliest myth makers, which constitutes an expression of the knowledge, are also the earliest astronomers, and therefore, as they write into the uranography, become the earliest cosmographers. So we need to know all these terms, and remember the list of questions I gave at the end of the first show. We're going to deal with those questions, but if you have an indigenous culture in North America that's called the Crow, that's your sign. That they still have Set as primary deity, however, they're fully in the north. And that the indigenous peoples had arrived here from Africa, let's say roughly around 250,000 years ago, still Sut as primary deity. And that the pyramids were built 150,000 years ago. That gives us some idea that somewhere between 200 and 150,000 years ago, we had Horus Behutet, which is the first contingency, which I've already made the contention that was the very first secret society, which meant it was actually a contingency that as it moved into the north, we wouldn't break our connection with Source, where Set is primary deity. So, we've opened up a lot of difficult subjects. I'm not giving you the kind of hard data that you're asking for, but see, there's no real easy solution to this. We got to understand this is perplexing our best minds.
Right.
So let's be humble and honest with ourselves that we're taking on some of the most difficult information that there is. And in my perspective, it's the most important information because, I've heard people say or in their research have a lot of profound knowledge about, let's say, for instance, the fact that the pyramid complex does represent an analog of Solomon's temple. So, this might sound strange to somebody, but I would say that the pyramids are the greatest Masonic temple that were ever built. And yes, it is originally Solomon's temple. So that's advanced. So a researcher that has deduced that through the study of the mystery traditions is into the advanced work, but may not be advanced enough into the work to deduce that is the ritual of the stone of the seven with the southern pyramid representing the lunar pyramid, corresponding to southern hemisphere, the northern pyramid corresponding to the solar pyramid, corresponding to the northern hemisphere, masculine solar energy, and that the Great Pyramid is the ritual in stone of the seven attributed to the stellar cult and venerated into Ursa Minor, which will always be semper supra, always above, always most high. So we have to understand that in that perspective, that part of the reason they stored it in Ursa Minor was because it would always be above. And we can identify that it's always above and associate that with most high. Whereas from the perspective of living in the southern hemisphere, venerating into the pole, that would be southern pole. But ideally, when we factor in the north, north is always above the south. So the spiritual idea associated with southern hemisphere was basically flipped over. Main thing is it's inverted. And that the significance of the southern hemisphere is still more significant in association with southern hemisphere. The spiritual idea of the spirit above and putting it into Ursa Minor is confusing because it has the potential to dominate and obscure the fact that southern hemisphere is associated with this feminine, which is associated with spiritual. So these are kind of things that I'm saying that the stellar people cared about and they understood, because these are the forces that we actually are working with in this time-space, three-dimensional time-space continuum, in the physical reality. That these are the forces that we're working with that are unseen, and that they fully understood these forces, and that the way that these forces were expressed and the way that these forces were endeavored to be codified for progeny and posterity, there's danger if they're not understood. So putting it primacy in the north is dangerous because the southern hemisphere is always associated with the spiritual realm. And that gets confusing because we know triangle represents the spiritual triune. It's a spiritual principle. And that the square represents the physical realm,
the material,
with the 4 points, the material, and that the triangle always goes on top of the square. That's confusing because we're starting out with the southern hemisphere associated with spiritual realm. So I know this is really stretching our brains out here hearing this, but this is really what it's about. Yeah. So if you're not fully understanding it, maybe I'm not doing the best job explaining it, but that's not the point. We have to understand it.
Yeah.
And I'm only trying to encourage you to understand it, because if we don't understand it, we don't understand why the pyramids were built in the first place.
Yeah, you actually just blew my mind with that, because I never, until on this show right now, I never realized that moving into the north, westing into the north, is it is when, you know, when we understand the aggregate of consciousness, and then we understand how each one of us are fragments of that consciousness. When most of our minds have been moved into this imbalance of masculine energy, or being in an imbalance of the left brain. And so when I think of the spirit, I think of ego as the lower part, right? And so I think of ego associated with left brain dominance.
I corroborate that.
And because of that, I'm seeing now that by Set moving into the north, it represents the material moving on top of the spirit, which it should be the opposite. It should be that the spirit is above the material. And I'm seeing that now. I'm understanding where you're coming from with that. I think you did a really good job of explaining that, because now I'm understanding more and more of why this was so important to the stellar people, because once the material goes on top of the spirit, that's when we live in the westing world.
Male dominator, masculine
that's right.
force is the dominating factor.
Yeah, exactly. Wow.
And this is where we get
everything is flipped right now.
Yeah, this is where we get the term upset, and that basically literally manifests as the unseen shadow work not being dealt with, not embracing and understanding the whole self, including the negative shadow of the self, that degree. See, it's confusing, but this is where we get the idea of upset, and it literally manifests as what we refer to often as zombie land. Because that's literally what we have, is the walking dead, in the sense that they're spiritually deadened people. So we are in zombie land because everybody's upset. They don't understand how the masculine force has dominated the feminine, and that this is an internal conundrum that can only be rectified on the individual level in the psychology of understanding the forces with which we're working and what is their proper orientation.
And
difficult. It's difficult material. So, you know, I'm prepared to be patient, but if we look at where the world is today, I wouldn't say that we have all of the time in the world to get this done. And I would say that, as I've already stated, it's only been possible in the last 100 years, so we can't squander this opportunity that, you know, our ancestors, through the period of nescience, all of their efforts will be in vain if we don't capitalize on this opportunity, where for the first time we actually have the ability to flesh it out for the most part and fully understand why these pyramids were built, understand what they mean, understand what these forces are that we're actually working with. See, people have a lot of misconceptions about spiritual ideas. That's part of how science is allowed to marginalize it all as superstition and just leave it at the door. You know, this is the conundrum in science. It's what we know as empiricism. In order for there to be something objective, it has to be an object. So we know that's a fallacy. And the ideas that we're talking about correspond to what we call this ancient psychology and this triune brain paradigm in correspondence with left brain, right brain, which correspond to these unseen forces, which we can associate with masculine and feminine forces that correspond to materialist and spiritual ideas. So yeah, there's a lot to it, but see, I don't want to discourage you with that. I want to encourage you that as we keep going forward with this, we're going to get more and more of the prerequisite knowledge coming out onto the table to understand, and it's going to come more into focus. And one more thing I want to say is that, you know, in regard to the idea, let's just say the idea of a truth movement, not saying that there is such a thing, but, you know, a lot of people have good intentions. What, you know, as far as what the significance of the progress that they've made, that's another story. But what I'm trying to say is, based on what I see, I think people are ready to see how the knowledge applies. And that's where that's the interesting stuff, because things are unraveling. But if you don't have the prerequisite knowledge to understand the significances of it, you're not really going to understand how it's unraveling. So I can show you how to apply the knowledge and it'll unravel. What I'm trying to say is most of what's in the modern world is post-Osiris, because they've obliterated everything that came before. So if we learn the ritual of Osiris and understand its full significance, which is the pinnacle of solar doctrine, most of the dogma in the world will unravel. But there's still a great deal of knowledge that will not unravel just by applying the solar doctrine alone. We need the earlier ideas from the lunar, ultimately the stellar, to fully unravel the significances of the septenary, for instance. And we know how prolific the septenary is. So we're really endeavoring to give you the foundations of the ideas, because hopefully at some point in this series, we're going to get to the point where we've laid enough groundwork and then start to show you how it unravels everything that came after. For instance, we've already mentioned, but I'll mention it again, Rome is built on the city of seven hills and faced by the Vatican, which typifies the eight, which we put in the emphasis on, is the care, is the one, is the representation of the generative principle. So Rome is a solar cult that built on the stellar hallowed ground that existed before the solar cult. And that ought to be enough proof that the pyramids are the ritual in stone of the seven. Okay, and maybe a lot of people don't know about this, but Cincinnati is the romantic term for the city of seven hills. So we have to understand at the onset of the solar cult, what they did was they gridded out the hallowed ground of the stellar people and built their temples on top of the destroyed stellar temples. They destroyed the stellar temples and built their solar temples on top of it. So need to understand that all new religions endeavor to obliterate all traces of their predecessors, that they're building their solar temples on already hallowed ground of the earlier phases of the mythos and the earlier culture. So we can expect that this is happening in more places than just Rome. In other words, there was other cities of seven hills. For instance, I'm in Columbus, Ohio. Well, just about an hour and a half south of me is the city of Cincinnati, and it's famous for its mounds. And I don't have to go there to know that there's seven, because it means the city of seven hills. And the significance of those seven mounds typify or bolster my claim that the earliest indigenous Americans are stellar people in a stagnated form. And I'll just give you one more example that's a little bit less significant of this unraveling, but, just for example, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. That's the seven glorious ones, or the eight glorious ones, or Horus and the seven glorious ones, and the Care. And the dwarves are Ursa Minor.
All right.
They're elemental powers. So Horus represent the enlightened being, the stellar man, head in the cosmos, feet on the ground, typified by the seven, as close as we can be to God in the physical manifestation, is typified in that fable. So that fable is ancient. Maybe the fable didn't come into existence until more contemporary times, but the idea for the fable is ancient, and there's no way that whoever basically constructed the fable didn't draw from the remnant of the earlier idea, which is a stellar concept based on the seven in relation to eight and the seven in relation to the six.
Right.
So it's Snow White and the seven dwarves, and the seven typifies Horus and the six glorious ones. Here's how you find the eight. I mean, it's one constellations plus the seven stars that make up the constellation, or it's one universe and the seven stars of Ursa Minor. So the eight is present, or the one is present to extend and get to the eight, or the return to the eight. There's so many points I want to make. Let me just throw this out there, because we've been talking about totemic sociology. We're going to get back into it. But the totem pole in a pure form is a seven, or an eight, but in the purest form, it's a seven, which means that the top totem of the totem pole is bird-headed, which is Egyptian. But the point I'm making is, as we go into the hero cults, this is what makes it difficult, because see, the earliest phase of the mythology from the totemic sociology is working with animism. And that's a confusing term that creates controversy. But so we'll talk about animism a little bit more, but it's the idea of spiritualizing everything. So we have to put that in context of spiritualizing everything that has true value, everything that's real knowledge, everything that has the potential to pass forward knowledge to progeny and posterity. That's the idea of animism. So in this totemic sociology, this is before they venerate into cycles. So the best way I would describe it is a stack. It's a stack which each totem of the stack represents a degree of merit. And then the top is bird-headed because that represents fully raised Kundalini energy That's different than venerating it into the cycle. So when it's venerated into the cycle in the northern circumpolar constellations, through the succession of the northern circumpolar pole stars, commencing with the 1, and then once it's succeeded by the 7th successive star, it's going to recommence. That 7th star corresponds to that top totem. So in the cycle, it's different than the stack. We have to remember that. I know that's advanced. We'll explain that more as we go, but just in one more thing I want to say. We can bring on that totemic sociology into the hero cult mythological phase, where it becomes what we know in modern masonry as Jacob's ladder. So the totem pole is Jacob's ladder because it represents a degree in merit.
Right.
And while I'm thinking of it, one of the mistakes that most people make, I've seen, is they reach for the higher rungs of the ladder before they've done their fundamental work. And you can't do that. You can't grab or grasp the higher rungs of the ladder until we get the foundations. And the foundations are where the real arduous work is. And the more we understand that, the more we understand why people aren't doing it and haven't done it, and in all likelihood aren't going to do it until they've suffered enough.
Right.
They're only going to do it when they realize there's no getting out of it.
Right. Well, again, it's been a pleasure to have you back on, and I'm really excited that we have this opportunity to get together and extrapolate on these really hard, heavy ideas. And it's really cool that I got to be on a show where my mind was blown. That was the first time that's happened since I've been on here, where I learned something that I really didn't know, and it's pretty exciting. And that's something that I love about doing this, is that I'm not just here to help others understand these ideas and to teach these difficult topics, but I'm here to learn, and I'm here to keep pushing myself and transcending dogma.
It's great to be part of the project, and I'm grateful for all that you do, and I'll look forward to speaking with you again on a future show.
This show is at an end, guys, so we appreciate you giving your time and attention here on this CubbyWhole podcast. And if you go to our website, which is CubbyWhole.com, that's CubbyWhole.com, you'll find more of Douglas Martin's work along with all the rest of the podcast episodes. And you'll find much more videos and news. So we hope you found value here on this show, and please make sure to go back to podcast 8 and 19 to better understand this show and future shows with Douglas pertaining to the ancient Egyptian mythos particularly. So stay tuned for more. Thanks, and keep transcending dogma.
All right. Thanks to everybody who made it this far. Don't forget you can use code BeagleEyeVision at w.gg to get 10% off your purchase. Clean, sugar-free, no jitter, no crash game fuel. It's good stuff. It's delicious too. It doesn't have a chalky taste. If you want to support the channel. And don't forget, if you want to see some hardcore punk rock this Saturday, tune into twitch.com/MEAC574, or just come on out to Elkhart, come on out to Michiana Education and Arts Club. Come join us, have some fun. All right. Hope you enjoyed this episode. There's a lot of intense knowledge. Thank you to Douglas Martin again. Thank you so much for all the work you've done, and for sharing all of that with us. That was really cool that Nate had his mind blown. That was cool. All right, so thanks again if you made it this far. Stay tuned for more, and stay golden.